Walter Grady, age 66, was a quiet presence on the streets of Brooklyn, where he had wandered for more than 10 years. Thin, his face weathered by time and hardship, he bore the look of someone who had once stood tall, but now simply endured. His beard, silver and matted, had long since lost the shape of care. Slung over his shoulder was an aging army backpack, its green color faded to near gray, with straps fraying like old memories. People in the neighborhood called him the Quiet One. He didn't ask for change or make scenes. He collected recyclables and graciously accepted leftover food from a few sympathetic restaurant employees. He never slept in the same doorway too many nights in a row, as though even in poverty, he didn't want to overstay his welcome. What most people didn't know was that Walter had once worn a uniform. For over 20 years, he'd served in the U.S. Army with honor. Retiring in 2004, his life took a sharp downward turn in 2008 when his wife, Margaret, passed away from cancer and illness the VA had failed to catch in time. Her death shattered him. Grief swallowed whatever was left of the man he'd been. He cut ties with his family, sold their apartment, and gave the proceeds to a charity Margaret had loved. Then he disappeared into the anonymity of New York City's endless streets. "It's easier not to be seen," he told a volunteer at a soup kitchen once. "Better than being the man who couldn't protect the one person who mattered." One cold November afternoon, with snow threatening and his stomach aching from hunger, Walter walked into Morelli's Corner Market. He hadn't eaten in days. With trembling fingers, he slipped a loaf of bread under his coat. The shopkeeper, distracted at first, noticed the theft thanks to a newly installed mirror near the register. "Hey, put that back. Don't move," Mr. Morelli shouted, grabbing for the phone. "I'm calling the police." Walter didn't resist. He just stood there, shoulders hunched, the bread barely hidden under his coat. "I just needed enough to get through today," he said, voice low. The police arrived minutes later. One of the officers, Jenkins, hesitated when he noticed the chain around Walter's neck, an old set of dog tags still intact. "You really a vet?" Jenkins asked, inspecting the tag dog. Walter nodded. "I used to be somebody. Sorry, sir, the store's pressing charges. Says this isn't the first time," Jenkins muttered, clearly uncomfortable. At the station, Walter was processed like any other low-level offender. The public defender assigned to him barely had time to learn his name before their brief meeting ended. His court hearing was scheduled for the next morning. When Walter arrived in court, he wore the same clothes he'd been arrested in, creased and worn from years in the elements. He entered alone. No one sat in the audience for him. No one came to speak on his behalf. In a courtroom filled with higher-profile cases, his situation barely registered as a blip. Case number 47,293, The People versus Walter Grady. The clerk called out. A young prosecutor stepped forward. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing bread. He has a record of petty theft and lacks a permanent address. The state recommends continued detention until trial." The judge presiding over the courtroom was Michael Carmichael, known for his strict, by-the-book attitude. He opened the file, scanning it quickly. He didn't look up right away. "How do you plead, Mr. Grady?" he asked. "Guilty, Your Honor," Walter replied, barely above a whisper. "I was hungry." A few snickers came from the back row. The judge silenced them with a glance before continuing, but then something in the file made him pause. "Walter Edward Grady, former staff sergeant, U.S. Army," he read, his voice suddenly more careful. The atmosphere in the room shifted. A sudden hush fell over the gallery. Judge Carmichael stared hard at the man in front of him. His expression tightened, and then, in an unexpected move, he stood from the bench. Judges don't stand during proceedings, especially not for minor offenses like this, but he remained standing, watching Walter closely, as though trying to piece together a distant memory. "Your Honor?" the prosecutor asked, confused. "We're taking a 15-minute recess," Carmichael said, his voice unsteady. "The defendant will remain." Without another word, he stepped down from the bench and left the room. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. In his chambers, the judge pulled open a drawer and retrieved an old photograph. A group of soldiers in dusty uniforms stood outside a military field tent. A younger Carmichael, back when he was a combat medic, was among them. Behind him, towering and strong, stood a familiar face, Walter Grady. The judge turned to his computer. logging into a secure database for military personnel. Within moments, Walter's record appeared, 3 deployments, including two in Iraq and one in Afghanistan. He'd served in combat logistics, often in high-risk zones. A report from 2003 detailed how he'd driven a burning truck away from wounded comrades, saving 17 lives. He'd received the Bronze Star for heroism. Then another file loaded a scanned newspaper photo from a decade ago, showing Walter lifting a wounded Afghan child onto a helicopter. The image had once been a symbol of hope during a controversial war. And then one final report, a mission summary from July 2003, during a brutal ambush. Walter had carried a wounded soldier, Private First Class Michael Carmichael, 2 miles through enemy fire. Despite having taken shrapnel to his own leg, the judge sat back, stunned. All these years, he whispered, it was him. He had never known the full name of the man who'd saved his life that night. He'd searched, but the trail had gone cold. The war had buried many names, and Walter had faded into the margins. Back in the courtroom, Walter sat exactly as they'd left him. The bailiff scrolled through his phone. No one paid attention. No one knew that the man they were ignoring had once carried a wounded child to safety under gunfire, or that he had once saved the life of the very judge presiding over his case. After Margaret's death, Walter had unraveled. PTSD, institutional failure, and bottomless grief stripped him of everything: benefits, identity, direction. People passed him on the street without seeing him. Teenagers mocked him. Shopkeepers pushed him away. Even others living rough avoided him when his nightmares got too loud. He never begged. He made do, recycled, found shelter where he could, bought cough syrup instead of whiskey, something to keep the winter from taking his lungs. But every night, deep in his coat, he kept one thing safe: a photograph of Margaret, sealed in plastic. Almost there, Maggie, he would murmur when nights grew long. Now, in a courtroom built for efficiency, meant to forget people like him, everything had begun to shift, all because someone finally remembered. He whispered under his breath, just a little longer, inside his chambers. Judge Michael Carmichael made an urgent series of phone calls. His voice, usually calm and measured, carried a rare edge. The first was to the Department of Veterans Affairs. He needed confirmation, and he needed it fast, about a man named Walter Grady. A second call followed, but this one wasn't official. "James, it's Carmichael," he said, voice low but steady. "I found him. The man who saved my life in Fallujah. He's here, in court, homeless, caught stealing bread." There was a long, loaded silence on the other end of the line. "I'm 3 hours out," the voice finally said. "Keep him there." It was Colonel James Mason, a man who had once fought, bled, and survived beside Walter. The judge grabbed a sheet of his personal court stationery and wrote a few words by hand. "Walter Grady is more than what he seems. He is a symbol of honor, duty, and the price of forgotten service." Though bound by judicial ethics and unable to dismiss the charges outright, Judge Carmichael was resolved. He couldn't let the system betray Walter again. As the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation before reconvening, the judge's clerk noticed something unexpected on his bench. A photograph, old and worn. In it, a soldier cradled a frightened Afghan child, shielding them from danger. That soldier was Walter. Scribbled underneath, in neat handwriting, was a note: "Some heroes never asked to be remembered." The clerk recognized the script instantly. It belonged to Colonel Mason. She'd seen it in past correspondence related to veteran support cases. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. Walter Grady wasn't just a name on a docket. He had left behind a trail of quiet valor. When court resumed, something in the air had changed. Walter sensed it. Judge Carmichael no longer viewed him through the lens of legal detachment. His eyes now held a deeper emotion, something like remorse, perhaps even admiration. Before Walter could fully comprehend, the judge addressed the court. In light of new revelations concerning the defendant's background, he said, "This court will suspend proceedings until a full review is conducted. Mr. Grady will remain in custody in the interim." The prosecutor, visibly caught off guard, said nothing. Walter gave a small, resigned nod. He'd long learned not to expect input in decisions that shaped his life. As officers approached to escort him out, the judge spoke once more. "Ensure Mr. Grady receives a hot meal and proper medical treatment." That evening, a local news blog published a provocative headline. Homeless man says he's a veteran. Judge delays sentence for bread theft. The comments section erupted with vitriol. Another fake vet. Where's his military ID? If he's legit, if he really served, why's he out here stealing food? Back in jail. The backlash took a darker turn. A younger inmate, eyes hard and full of rage, shoved Walter against a wall after reading an article on a contraband phone. You're disgusting. He spat. My brother died overseas. And you're just playing the soldier card. Walter didn't defend himself. He didn't raise his hands or even speak. He took it, just like he'd taken so many other hits, with quiet acceptance. Fading further into the background, that night, he was offered warm food, but barely touched it. Sitting on the narrow cot, he gripped things, a battered pair of dog tags and a weathered photo of Margaret, the woman he had once loved. His thoughts circled one question over and over. Why now? Why had someone finally seen him? Have you ever passed judgment on someone just by how they looked? Maybe someone you know needs to be reminded of that today. The next morning, Walter was led back into the courtroom, unaware that everything had changed. Yesterday, the gallery had been nearly empty. Today, not a single seat remained unfilled. Journalists and cameras crowded the sidewalk outside, though they weren't allowed inside. Their presence buzzed like static through the walls. As Walter sat down, he noticed something else. His usual, overwhelmed public defender was gone. In their place sat an older man in a crisp suit, composed and confident. Richard Harlow, the man said, offering his hand. Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. We've taken interest in your case, Mr. Grady. Walter blinked, trying to make sense of the sudden shift, but received no further explanation. Then the doors opened. Everyone stood. Judge Carmichael entered, his expression unreadable. But before Walter could sit, he saw movement at the back of the room. 3 military officers in full dress uniform stepped through the door. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Walter Grady was no longer invisible. ***. The bailiff's voice echoed through the tense courtroom. All rise for the Honorable Judge Michael Carmichael. There was a distinct weight in the air, something unspoken that made everyone sit straighter. Judge Carmichael entered with a gravity that hadn't been present the day before. Before we address the charges concerning Mr. Grady, the judge began. This court will first hear testimony that may provide critical context regarding his background. Walter Grady looked puzzled as a tall man in military uniform stepped toward the witness stand. Though the years had left their mark, the man's bearing was unmistakably that of a soldier. After taking the oath, his voice rang with sharp authority. I'm Colonel James Mason, currently stationed at Fort Hamilton. I served alongside Staff Sergeant Walter Grady during our deployment to Iraq in 2003. He turned toward Walter, and his tone grew gentler. This man risked everything during an ambush near Fallujah. He drove a fuel truck already ablaze away from his fellow soldiers, despite being shot in the process. His actions stopped what would have been a catastrophic explosion. Gas swept across the room. Mason wasn't finished. Later that day, though injured himself, he carried our medic, a young private named Michael Carmichael, over 2 miles to get him to safety. All eyes shifted toward the judge's bench for a moment. Judge Carmichael's professional mask slipped, and he gave a slow, solemn nod. The prosecutor rose, clearly uncomfortable. Your Honor, while this is indeed powerful testimony, Mr. Grady is still facing a charge of theft. Colonel Mason held up a manila file. With the court's permission, I'd like to share further information. He opened the file and continued, Mr. Grady's military benefits were mistakenly terminated in 2008 during a digital system overhaul. The issue, a change of address form, never reached him, and critical notices went to an outdated location. Because of that, he never received his pension or health care. The room fell completely silent. He was supposed to receive over $1,300 a month for the past 15 years. That totals more than $246,000 in unpaid compensation. Walter sat motionless, gripping the edge of the defense table as though holding on for balance. Mason went on. Inside this folder are also affidavits from 5 of our former unit members. Each one speaks to Walter's character and sacrifice. One is from General Richards, whose son was among the lives Walter saved that day. Judge Carmichael leaned forward, eyes fixed on Walter. Mr. Grady, would you please step forward? Walter slowly rose, his steps tentative, unsure. In most cases, the judge said, I would step away from a matter involving someone I have personal ties to, but yesterday, I didn't know who you were. I only realized the truth after reading your file. The judge removed his glasses and took a breath. For years, I've tried to find the soldier who carried me out of that chaos. All I could recall was the name Grady, shouted between gunfire and smoke, and now, here you are. Walter's voice trembled. I was only doing what any soldier would, sir. The judge shook his head slowly. No, you went far beyond that, and we this country have failed you. He turned to the state's attorney. In light of this information, does the prosecution still wish to move forward? The prosecutor stood, visibly moved. Your Honor, the state withdraws all charges, with prejudice. Then it is so ordered, Judge Carmichael said firmly. Mr. Grady, you are free to go. And on behalf of this court, I offer not just an apology for today, but for the years of neglect you should never have endured. Just then, the courtroom, doors opened. A woman entered, scanning the room until her eyes locked on Walter. Tears already in her eyes, she approached him. Uncle Walter, she said gently, I'm Rebecca, Margaret's niece. We've been searching for you for so long. Walter looked at her in disbelief, emotion welling up in his eyes. When she embraced him, he finally broke. For the first time in years, he was being touched with affection, not authority. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed toward Colonel Mason. This is bigger than just one man. He told them, there are so many veterans, forgotten and caught in bureaucratic failures. This must be the beginning of change. By evening, the story had gone viral. News helicopters hovered over the courthouse. Cameras captured Walter stepping outside clean-shaven in donated clothes, with Colonel Mason and Judge Carmichael at his side. No longer a defendant, just a man whose story had finally come to light. Even Mr. Morelli, the shop owner who had filed the complaint, made his way through the crowd. I didn't know who he was, he admitted, guilt lining his face. I thought he was just another homeless guy. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Walter nodded slightly, words failing him. In a flood of emotion, within 48 hours, a national veterans organization launched a fundraiser for Walter. Donations quickly passed $200,000 across social media. People shared similar stories, veterans left behind by the very institutions meant to protect them. And at the center of it all was a man who once steered a flaming truck away from his comrades, who carried a young medic to safety through blood and fire. A man who had been forgotten until now. Asters Gasters, the Department of Veterans Affairs, had quietly launched a review of benefit terminations, and efforts spurred not by policy, but by a conversation that had waited 20 years to be spoken aloud, behind closed doors. Judge Michael Carmichael finally broke the silence that had weighed on him for decades. You carried me, he said, voice soft with emotion. 2 miles, shrapnel in your leg. The medic said you wouldn't let them touch you until they'd stabilized me. Walter Grady gave a quiet shrug. You were in worse shape. You said something back then, when I was fading in and out. Just keep breathing, kid. Your story is not over. Those words stayed with me, kept me alive, gave me purpose. The judge took a breath. I became who I am because of that moment, because of you. Walter looked at him not as a man in robes and authority, but as the frightened, bleeding young soldier he'd once dragged to safety. I'm glad something good came from that day, he said. It wasn't just good, the judge replied. It was everything. My life, my work, my family, it all came from that choice you made. You didn't leave me behind. For the first time in a long while, Walter's face softened. A true smile appeared, faint but sincere, and his tired eyes, dulled by years of being unseen, shone briefly. I wasn't quoting orders, Walter said. I meant it. No one gets left behind. 3 days later, Walter stood in the judge's chambers in a crisp new suit. For the first time in years, medals glinted on his chest, symbols of valor and sacrifice, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and others that spoke to a history no longer forgotten. A representative from the VA presented him with overdue back pay and a settlement meant to correct years of error. This time, the press was invited. Walter spoke only a few words. I don't want anyone's pity. I just hope no one else disappears like I did. What had begun as a quiet moment between two men became a national moment of reflection. His story was shared in hearings on Capitol Hill, prompting discussions on systemic failures in caring for veterans. The photos spread across the internet. One of Walter in uniform, cradling an injured Afghan child, the other of him sitting on a city sidewalk, ignored by passersby. The contrast struck a nerve. He had gone unseen for more than 10 years. Now, he had become impossible to overlook. Half a year later, Walter moved into a small apartment at Veterans Village in Brooklyn. It wasn't fancy, but it was his home, something he hadn't had since his wife, Margaret, passed away. His belongings were few, but precious. Faded photos of Margaret, snapshots of his unit, and a new picture him and Judge Carmichael standing side by side at a ceremony for those who had served. He rarely spoke to the media, but he began visiting schools. His calm, direct manner free of self-pity struck a chord with students, especially those going through their own struggles. Most afternoons, he could be found at Prospect Park. Sometimes, he sat on the very bench he once slept on through winter nights, now watching children run and play in the sunlight dot outside the courthouse. A plaque was installed. It read, "Justice means remembering the forgotten." Beside it, a bronze relief showed Walter carrying a wounded soldier, chaos behind them, the flag waving above. At the dedication, the mayor announced a new initiative to offer legal help to homeless veterans named in Walter's honor died in a classroom nearby. A young boy who had once seen Walter collecting bottles wrote an award-winning essay. "Not everyone in torn clothes is dangerous. Some people wear memories instead." Walter and the judge became close. He occasionally had dinner with the Carmichael family, sitting at their table like an old friend. One evening, the judge's son asked, "Were you angry about what happened?" Walter thought for a moment. "I wasn't after pity," he said. "I just wanted the future to remember the people who came before." On Veterans Day, Walter appeared at Fort Hamilton in full uniform, the first time he'd worn it in decades. He kept his remarks brief. "I defended this country once," he said. "Now, finally, it's defended me." He paused, then added, "Kindness takes time, but it's never wasted. You just have to wait for it." As he stepped away from the microphone, the crowd stood and saluted in silence. Walter returned the gesture, tall and steady, his gaze forward. He no longer looked down when he walked. He looked toward what still lay ahead. Justice hadn't come quickly, but it had come. And for those still overlooked, still waiting, Walter's quiet voice remained. "Hold on. Do what's right. One day, someone will notice." And back in that courtroom, long before the nation knew his name, when asked why he'd taken a loaf of bread, he'd said only, "I just needed strength to get through the day." Some in the courtroom had chuckled, but not the judge, because in that moment, he recognized the name. It wasn't just a name, it was a bond, a memory, and a debt that had finally been honored.